What happens when a family that always treated you like an afterthought tries to erase you one last time, only to find out you were holding their fate in your hands all along? I walked into court for my mother's inheritance, expecting another round of public humiliation, but one question from the judge turned everything upside down, exposing a secret I kept for 8 long years, and leaving my father and brother ruined in front of everyone. The antiseptic smell of Riverside General Hospital had become as familiar to me as my own apartment. For 3 months, I'd spent every evening in room 314, watching my mother, Marianne Foster, fade away while fighting pancreatic cancer. The chair beside her bed had molded to my body. I was there so often that the night nurses knew my coffee order. "Caleb, honey," Mom whispered one Tuesday evening, her voice barely audible above the steady beep of monitors. Her once vibrant auburn hair had thinned to wispy strands, and her hands, which used to be so strong from years of gardening, trembled as she reached for mine. "I need to tell you something important." I leaned closer, adjusting her blanket. At 37, I'd grown accustomed to being the responsible one, the quiet IT specialist who handled problems without fanfare. While my younger brother Ethan charmed clients in his sales job and my father Franklin boasted about his real estate glory days, I was the one who researched treatment options, coordinated with doctors, and made sure Mom's medications were filled on time. "What is it, Mom?" I squeezed her frail hand gently. She glanced toward the door, then back at me with an intensity I hadn't seen in weeks. "There's something about your birth, about Ethan's birth, that I never told anyone, not even your father." Before she could continue, the door burst open with the kind of dramatic flair that announced my family's arrival. Franklin Foster, 65 and still carrying himself like the hotshot realtor he used to be, strode in wearing his expensive suit and that practiced smile he'd perfected for closing deals. Behind him, my 33-year-old brother Ethan adjusted his designer tie and checked his phone. "There's our patient," Franklin announced loudly, as if Mom were across a crowded room instead of lying weakly in a hospital bed. "How are we feeling today, Marianne?" Mom's hand tightened around mine, and I saw her jaw clench. Even in her weakened state, I could tell she was frustrated by the interruption. Ethan barely glanced at her before launching into a story about his latest sales commission. "You wouldn't believe the deal I closed today, Mom. This couple from Westchester, total suckers for the premium package. I walked away with a $15,000 bonus." He laughed, running his fingers through his perfectly styled dark hair. "I'm thinking of upgrading the BMW. Maybe get one of those new models with the—" "Ethan," I said quietly, "maybe we could talk about cars later? Mom was trying to tell me something." Franklin waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, Caleb, don't be so serious all the time. Your mother likes hearing about our successes, don't you, honey?" He patted Mom's shoulder with the same casual gesture he'd use on a business associate. "Keeps her spirits up." I watched Mom's face carefully. Her eyes were closed, and I could see the exhaustion settling over her like a heavy blanket. The conversation she'd started would have to wait. For the next hour, Franklin and Ethan dominated the small room with their voices. Franklin regaled us with stories of properties he'd sold decades ago, embellishing details with each retelling. Ethan scrolled through his phone, occasionally showing us photos of expensive restaurants he'd visited or luxury items he was considering buying. Neither of them asked Mom how she was feeling, neither noticed when she winced in pain or when her breathing became labored. They were performing their version of family devotion, but it was all surface, all show. "Well," Franklin finally announced, checking his gold watch, "we should probably head out. Big day tomorrow. I'm meeting with my financial advisor about some investment opportunities." Ethan nodded eagerly. "Yeah, and I've got that client dinner at Morton's. Can't keep the money waiting, right?" He gave Mom a quick peck on the forehead, the kind of absent gesture you'd give a distant relative at a holiday gathering. As they prepared to leave, Mom struggled to sit up slightly. "Franklin," she said, her voice stronger than it had been all evening, "I wanted to talk to you about my will, about what happens when—" Hey, Franklin interrupted, his voice taking on that patronizing tone he used when he thought someone was being overly dramatic. "Let's not talk about depressing stuff. You're going to beat this thing, Marianne. No need to worry about paperwork and legal nonsense." Ethan was already halfway to the door. "Dad's right, Mom. Stay positive. Focus on getting better, not on, you know." He made a vague gesture that brushed aside both the worst possible outcome and any serious discussion about it. I felt my mother's hand squeeze mine again, and when I looked at her, I saw tears forming in her eyes. Not from pain this time, but from something deeper. The recognition that the 2 men she'd spent her life caring for couldn't even stay present for a conversation about her final wishes. "We'll talk later, Mom," I said softly. "When you're feeling stronger." She nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on Franklin and Ethan as they headed for the door, already deep in conversation about weekend golf plans. 3 weeks later, I was back in room 314, this time holding Mom's hand as she slipped in and out of consciousness. It was a Thursday night, and I'd taken the day off work to stay with her. The doctors had made it clear that we were in the final stages, that it was a matter of days, maybe hours. I'd called Franklin and Ethan that morning, explaining the situation, asking them to come as soon as possible. Franklin said he'd be there after his lunch meeting. Ethan promised to swing by after he finished up with a crucial client presentation. By 8 o'clock that evening, neither had shown up. Mom stirred around 9, her eyes opening slowly. When she saw me, she managed a weak smile. "Still here, sweetheart?" Where else would I be? I brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. She looked toward the door, and I knew she was hoping to see Franklin and Ethan. When she realized we were alone, something shifted in her expression, a mixture of sadness and resolution. "Caleb," she whispered, "I need to tell you what I tried to say before, about you and Ethan." I leaned closer, my heart pounding. Something in her tone told me this wasn't just a woman at the end of her strength speaking at random. "When you were born," she continued, her voice gaining strength as if this confession was giving her energy, "your father and I were having problems. We'd been trying to have a baby for years, and the doctor said it might not happen. Franklin was seeing someone else." I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't the story I'd grown up with, the tale of high school sweethearts who'd built a perfect family together. I was hurt, angry. I had an affair with someone, a good man who treated me the way I deserved to be treated. When I got pregnant with you, I let Franklin believe you were his. We reconciled, and 4 years later, I had Ethan. He's Franklin's biological son. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at her, trying to process what she was telling me. "I had a DNA test done 6 months ago," she continued, reaching toward her bedside table with trembling fingers. "When I got the cancer diagnosis, I knew I had to be sure. I had to know the truth before—" She pulled out a manila envelope from beneath a stack of magazines. "It's all in here. The test results, a letter I wrote explaining everything, and a copy of my will." My hand shook as I took the envelope. "Mom, why are you telling me this now?" "Because my will specifies that everything, the house, the savings, all of it, goes to my biological son. I wrote it that way on purpose." Her eyes were fierce now, more alert than I'd seen her in weeks. "Franklin and Ethan have spent years treating you like you don't matter, like you're just the helper, the one who takes care of things while they take credit and collect rewards, but you're the one who's been here. You're the one who cared." Before I could respond, the door opened again. Franklin walked in, followed by Ethan, both of them looking slightly annoyed, as if visiting a woman in such a fragile state was an inconvenience they'd finally bothered to deal with. "Sorry we're late," Franklin said without any real apology in his voice. "My meeting ran long, and then Ethan and I grabbed dinner to discuss some business opportunities." Ethan nodded, not bothering to explain his absence. He glanced at Mom, then at me. "You look tired, Caleb. Maybe you should head home, get some rest. Dad and I can take over from here." The casual dismissal was so typical, so perfectly in character, that I almost laughed. Here I was, holding a secret that would destroy their assumptions about everything, and Ethan was treating me like hired help that could be sent home when the real family arrived. "Actually," Franklin said, his voice taking on that authoritative tone he'd perfected in business, "Caleb, why don't you give us some privacy? Ethan and I need to discuss some important matters with your mother. Family business." The phrase family business hung in the air like a slap, as if I weren't family, as if my months of daily visits, my careful attention to Mom's needs, my research into treatments and specialists, none of it qualified me for inclusion in family business. I looked at Mom, and she gave me the slightest nod. Her eyes moved to the envelope in my hands, then back to my face. The message was clear. Keep this safe. Keep this secret. Wait for the right moment. "Of course," I said, standing up slowly. I slipped the envelope into my jacket pocket, feeling its weight like a loaded weapon. "I'll let you handle things." Franklin's smile was patronizing, the same expression he'd worn when dismissing my opinions throughout my childhood. "That's what we need, Caleb. Someone who understands their role." As I walked toward the door, I heard Ethan already launching into another story about his sales numbers, his voice loud and cheerful in the quiet room where our mother was slipping away. Franklin was nodding along, occasionally glancing at his phone. Neither of them asked her how she was feeling, neither noticed the tears on her cheeks or the way her breathing had become more labored. I paused at the door and looked back. Mom's eyes found mine across the room, and in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just about money or property. This was about recognition, about justice, about finally revealing who had truly been her son when it mattered most. My phone buzzed as I walked down the hospital corridor. A text from Mom. Somehow she'd found the strength to type a message. The envelope has everything you need. Wait for the right moment. I love you, my biological son. I stopped walking, leaning against the wall as the full weight of what she'd told me settled in. For 37 years, I'd been the outsider, the one who didn't quite fit, the one who was tolerated rather than celebrated. Now I understood why. And more importantly, I understood that I held the power to change everything. But as I rode the elevator down to the parking garage, I made a decision that would define the next 8 months of my life. I would wait. I would keep this secret until the moment it could do the most good, until the moment Franklin and Ethan's arrogance and greed were on full display for everyone to see. The right moment would come, and when it did, they would finally understand who the real family was. Mom passed away 3 days later, on a Sunday morning, while Franklin and Ethan were both at home, likely sleeping off the previous night's excess. I was there, holding her hand when she finally let go. The nurses said she'd been waiting for me, that people often hold on until the person who matters most is by their side. I called Franklin first, then Ethan. Both answered on the fourth ring, their voices groggy and irritated. "She's gone," I said simply. There was a pause, then Franklin cleared his throat. "Well, I guess we knew this was coming. What do we need to do about arrangements?" Not, "How are you holding up?" or "I'm sorry we weren't there." Just logistics, just the next item on a to-do list. The funeral was held at Riverside Memorial Chapel 4 days later. I'd handled most of the arrangements, choosing the flowers Mom had loved, selecting photos that captured her genuine smile, writing an obituary that honored her kindness and strength. Franklin and Ethan showed up an hour before the service, both impeccably dressed and ready to play their roles as grieving widower and son. I watched from the back of the room as they worked the crowd of mourners, accepting condolences with practiced grace. Franklin told everyone about Mom's brave battle and how blessed they'd been to have her. Ethan nodded solemnly and thanked people for coming, occasionally mentioning how difficult this time was for the family. But I noticed what others might have missed. When Mrs. Patterson from next door mentioned how often she'd seen me at the house during Mom's illness, Franklin quickly redirected the conversation. When one of Mom's former coworkers commented on how devoted I'd been, staying with her through every treatment, Ethan smoothly changed the subject to his own busy work schedule. They were erasing my presence from the narrative, rewriting the story to make themselves the central figures in Mom's final months. The most telling moment came during the reception afterward. I was standing near Mom's photo display when I overheard Franklin and Ethan talking with Richard Hawthorne, the family lawyer who'd handled Dad's real estate transactions for years. "So when can we get this will business sorted out?" Ethan asked, his voice low but not quite low enough. "I mean, I know it's early to talk about it, but I've got some financial commitments coming up." Franklin nodded. "Ethan's right. Marianne was always practical about these things. She'd want us to handle the estate efficiently, not drag it out with unnecessary sentiment." Richard adjusted his expensive glasses and spoke in the measured tones that lawyers use when discussing money. "Well, the will is fairly straightforward. She leaves everything to her biological son. Given that you have 2 sons, we'll need to determine how she intended that to be interpreted. It's possible she meant both of you, or perhaps she was simply being formal in her language." I felt my heart rate spike. The envelope in my apartment contained the answer to Richard's question, but I kept my expression neutral, pretending to study the photo of Mom in her garden. "Honestly," Ethan said with a laugh, "knowing Mom, she probably meant it should all go to Franklin and me equally. Caleb's never been much for handling money or property. He's more of a support person." Franklin chuckled. "That's diplomatic, Ethan. Caleb means well, but he's never had much ambition. Marianne always worried about him, wondered if he'd be able to take care of himself. She'd want the inheritance to go to people who can actually manage it properly. Besides," Ethan added, "Caleb's got his little IT job. He doesn't need much. Dad and I have bigger responsibilities, more complex financial situations." They were talking about me as if I were a child or a family pet that needed basic care but couldn't be trusted with important decisions. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking, not just that they planned to exclude me, but that they genuinely believed I didn't deserve inclusion. I stepped away from the photo display and walked outside, needing air. The funeral home's parking lot was full of cars belonging to people who genuinely cared about Mom, who'd come to honor her memory. But inside, Franklin and Ethan were already dividing up her possessions like items at an estate sale. My phone buzzed. A text from Aunt Sharon, Mom's sister, who lived in Oregon and hadn't been able to make the funeral. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there, Caleb. Your mother talked about you constantly, how proud she was, how much you sacrificed to care for her. I hope Franklin and Ethan appreciate what you did. I stared at the message, feeling a mix of gratitude and sadness. At least someone understood. At least someone had seen the truth. That evening, I sat in my small apartment, surrounded by the quiet that had become my constant companion. I'd lived alone for 5 years. Ever since my last relationship had ended, another casualty of my tendency to prioritize family obligations over personal desires. The place was neat, organized, filled with books, and the kind of practical furniture that prioritized function over style. I pulled out the manila envelope Mom had given me and spread its contents across my kitchen table. The DNA test results were clinical and clear. Probability of paternity, 0%. Franklin Foster is not the biological father of Caleb Foster. A separate test showed a 99.7% probability that Franklin was Ethan's biological father. There was also a handwritten letter from Mom, her careful script filling 3 pages of stationery. My dearest Caleb, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're facing the same dismissal and disrespect you've endured your entire life. I should have told you the truth years ago, should have stood up to Franklin's favoritism and Ethan's casual cruelty. But I was scared. Scared of destroying our family, scared of admitting my own mistakes, scared of the chaos that truth sometimes brings. Your biological father was a man named Vincent Moreau, a teacher at the community college where I took art classes during my separation from Franklin. He was kind, intelligent, and treated me with the respect I'd forgotten I deserved. When I discovered I was pregnant, Vincent wanted to marry me, wanted to raise you together. But Franklin came back, promising to change, and I made the decision to reconcile, partly out of love, partly out of fear of being a single mother. Vincent was lost in a car accident when you were 3 years old. He never knew for certain that you were his son, but he suspected. In his will, he left a small trust fund for any children he might have had. That money has been growing for 34 years, and it's now worth nearly $200,000. It's yours, Caleb. It always was. But more than the money, I want you to know that every day of your life, you've been exactly the son I hoped you'd become. Your kindness, your reliability, your quiet strength, these aren't weaknesses, no matter what Franklin and Ethan might think. You are the best of both your fathers. Vincent's gentleness and intelligence, combined with a determination that's entirely your own. My will leaves everything to my biological son, because I wanted there to be no ambiguity when the truth comes out. The house, the savings account, the jewelry, all of it, it's yours. Not because you need it more than Ethan, but because you earned it through 37 years of being the son who truly cared. I'm sorry I didn't have the courage to tell this truth while I was alive. I'm sorry you had to carry this burden alone, but I trust you to know when the time is right to reveal what I couldn't. All my love, Mom. I read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of meaning. Mom had been protecting me, in her way, but she'd also been protecting herself and the family structure she'd built on a foundation of secrets. The 3rd document was her will, witnessed and notarized, crystal clear in its language. I leave all my worldly possessions to my biological son, with the understanding that he will know the significance of this designation. I looked at my calendar. The will reading was scheduled for 8 months from now, standard procedure for estates of this size. 8 months to watch Franklin and Ethan assume they'd won, 8 months to let their arrogance grow, 8 months to prepare for the moment when everything would change. Over the following weeks, I began to understand just how deep their dismissal ran. At the family gathering after the funeral, held at Franklin's house, I watched them hold court in the living room where I'd spent countless childhood evenings feeling invisible. Franklin sat in his leather recliner, the same chair he'd occupied during family dinners, holiday celebrations, and Sunday football games. It was his throne, the place from which he'd dispensed opinions, corrections, and casual put-downs throughout my youth. You know, he said to the assembled relatives, Marianne always worried about Caleb. Wonderful woman, but she had a soft spot for strays. He chuckled, and several cousins smiled politely. She'd want us to make sure he's taken care of, but she'd also want the bulk of her estate to go where it can do the most good. Ethan, lounging on the couch with his usual casual confidence, nodded sagely. Mom was practical. She understood that some people are builders and some people are maintainers. Caleb's great at maintaining things, keeping them running, but Dad and I are the ones who actually create value, who make things grow. I was sitting in the corner, in the same spot I'd occupied during family gatherings for decades, present but peripheral, included but not central. listening to them plan my future exclusion with the same casual authority they'd used to assign me chores as a child. The house alone is worth $400,000, Franklin continued. Then there's the savings, the retirement accounts, the jewelry. Marianne was more financially savvy than people realized. She's leaving behind a substantial estate. Which is why it needs to be managed properly, Ethan added. I mean, no offense to Caleb, but he's never shown much interest in investments or property management. He's more comfortable with simpler responsibilities. The conversation continued around me, with relatives nodding and offering their own observations about my limitations and Franklin and Ethan's superior qualifications. I was being discussed like an incompetent child whose future needed to be decided by the responsible adults. But I sat quietly, thinking about the envelope in my apartment, about the trust fund I'd never known existed, about the will that would turn their assumptions upside down. Let them plan. Let them assume. Let them build their confidence higher and higher. The fall would be that much more dramatic. 2 months after Mom's funeral, Franklin and Ethan's casual disrespect had evolved into something more calculated and cruel. They'd moved beyond simply excluding me from family decisions. Now they were actively working to minimize my role in Mom's life and legacy. It started with small things. When people asked about Mom's final months, Franklin would mention how difficult it had been for the family to watch her decline, glossing over the fact that I'd been her primary caregiver. Ethan began telling people that Mom had spent her last weeks surrounded by love, without mentioning that he'd visited her exactly 4 times in 3 months. But the real escalation came when they decided to meet with Richard Hawthorne to discuss strategy for the will reading. I learned about the meeting by chance, overhearing Ethan on the phone while we were both at Franklin's house, sorting through Mom's belongings, a task they'd finally addressed 12 weeks after she was gone. "Yeah, Richard, we need to get ahead of this," Ethan was saying, his voice carrying that confident tone he used when closing sales deals. "Dad and I have been thinking, and we're pretty sure Mom intended for the inheritance to be split between her sons, meaning Dad and me, obviously. Caleb's, well, he's family, but he's never really been part of the financial side of things." I continued sorting through Mom's jewelry box, keeping my expression neutral while listening to my brother casually erase my existence from our family's financial future. "The thing is," Ethan continued, "Caleb might try to make some kind of claim, and we want to be prepared. He's been acting a little entitled lately, like he thinks taking care of Mom somehow gives him special rights or something." Franklin appeared in the doorway, carrying a box of Mom's books. "Is that Richard?" When Ethan nodded, Franklin set down the box and held out his hand for the phone. "Richard, it's Franklin. Listen, I want to be very clear about something. Marianne and I built our estate together over 40 years of marriage. When she wrote that will, she was thinking about our biological family, our real legacy. Caleb's a good kid, but he's never been the type to handle significant responsibility." The phrase, "our biological family," hit me like a physical blow. If only they knew how accurate that phrase was, and how completely it excluded Franklin himself. "What we're worried about," Franklin continued, "is that Caleb might have gotten some ideas during those last months. Spending so much time with Marianne, maybe she said some things. You know how sick people can get confused about their intentions?" I felt my hands clench around Mom's jewelry. They weren't just planning to shut me out. They were preparing to argue that anything Mom might have told me was the result of illness-driven confusion. They were ready to manipulate the situation by exploiting her passing. "Exactly," Franklin said, obviously responding to something Richard had said. "We need to be ready to fight this if necessary. Ethan and I have lawyers, we have resources, and we have the moral authority of being her real family. If Caleb wants to make this difficult, we'll make it very difficult for him." The threat was clear, delivered in the same tone Franklin had used throughout my childhood, when explaining why I couldn't have something I wanted, why I didn't deserve the same treatment as Ethan, why I needed to understand my place in the family hierarchy. After Franklin hung up, he and Ethan spent the next hour strategizing. They discussed hiring additional legal counsel, gathering character witnesses who would testify about my limitations, and preparing financial documents that would demonstrate their superior ability to manage Mom's estate. The key, Richard had apparently told them, is to establish a pattern of responsibility and capability. We need to show that Marianne would naturally want her estate to go to the family members who could best honor her legacy. Ethan laughed. "That's easy. Dad's got 40 years of successful business dealings. I've got a proven track record in sales, a growing client base, real financial sophistication. What does Caleb have? A steady job fixing computers and a 1-bedroom apartment." "Don't forget," Franklin added, "Caleb's never been married, never had kids, never built anything lasting. Marianne would want her money to go toward building a family legacy, not just existing. They were building their case against me using every insecurity I'd ever had, every way I'd failed to live up to their definition of success. The quiet life I'd chosen, the simple apartment I'd been content with, the focus on stability over ambition, all of it was being weaponized to justify my exclusion. But as I listened to them plan my destruction, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: calm. They were so confident, so certain of their superiority, that they weren't even being careful about what they said in front of me. They truly believed I was no threat, that I lacked the intelligence, resources, or backbone to challenge them. That evening, I drove to Riverside First National, the bank where Mom had maintained her accounts for 30 years. I'd been added as a joint holder on her checking account during her illness to help pay medical bills and manage her expenses. But there was something else I needed to check on, something Mom had mentioned in her letter. "I'd like to access my safety deposit box," I told the banker, producing the key Mom had hidden in her jewelry case along with a note giving me access. Inside the small metal box, I found exactly what I'd hoped for: additional copies of the DNA test, the will, and her letter, along with documents related to Vincent Moreau's trust fund. There was also something I hadn't expected: a small journal where Mom had recorded Franklin and Ethan's behavior during her illness. March 15th. Franklin visited for 20 minutes, spent most of the time talking about a golf tournament, didn't ask about my pain levels or treatment, left when visiting hours ended, said he had dinner plans. March 22nd. Ethan called instead of visiting. Said he was too busy with work to come by, but I could hear restaurant noise in the background. Caleb has been here every day this week. April 3rd. Franklin brought flowers, but spent the entire visit on his phone dealing with some business matter. Caleb had to ask him twice to step outside when the doctor came in. Page after page of careful documentation, a woman in her final decline recording who had truly cared and who had merely gone through the motions of family devotion. I made copies of everything, storing the originals back in the safety deposit box and taking the copies to my office. My workplace, a mid-sized IT consulting firm, had excellent document storage and copying facilities. I spent my lunch break creating multiple backup sets, storing them in different locations. My colleague Janet noticed me working with personal documents. "Everything okay, Caleb? You've seemed pretty stressed lately." "Just family stuff," I said, sealing the documents in labeled envelopes. "Getting some paperwork organized." She nodded sympathetically. "I remember when my mom passed. The legal stuff is always more complicated than you expect. Family can get weird about money." If only she knew how weird it was about to get. That weekend, I received a text from Ethan that crystallized everything I'd been feeling. "Hey bro, been thinking about Mom's house. Dad and I are planning to put it on the market in a few months. You should probably start looking for anything personal you want to keep. We're going to need to clear it out for staging. Fair warning. We can't keep everything for sentimental reasons. Business is business." The casual cruelty of it was stunning. He was giving me permission to take a few keepsakes from my own mother's house before he and Franklin sold it out from under me. And he was framing it as a favor, as if he were being generous by allowing me to salvage a few memories. I texted back, "I understand. I'll respect Mom's wishes, whatever they turn out to be." His response came immediately. "Good attitude. This doesn't have to be complicated if everyone stays realistic about expectations." Franklin called me that evening, his voice carrying that patronizing warmth he used when he thought he was being magnanimous. "Caleb, I want you to know that Ethan and I have been talking, and we're not going to leave you out in the cold. Once the estate is settled, we'll make sure you get something, maybe enough for a down payment on a better apartment or some money for a vacation. Your mother would want us to take care of you." The offer was clearly meant to sound generous, but it was actually an insult wrapped in false kindness. A few $1,000s thrown my way like a tip for good service, while they split an estate worth over $500,000. "That's very thoughtful," I said carefully, "but I think we should wait and see what Mom's will actually says before making any plans." There was a pause, and when Franklin spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly. Of course. Oh, but Caleb, I hope you're not getting any unrealistic ideas. Your mother was a practical woman. She understood how the world works, who's equipped to handle significant financial responsibility." "I'm sure she did," I replied. "I'm sure she thought very carefully about her decisions." After I hung up, I sat in my apartment, surrounded by the evidence that would soon turn their world upside down. 8 months had seemed like a long time to wait when Mom first gave me that envelope. Now it felt like barely enough time to prepare for the earthquake I was about to unleash. I opened my laptop and created a new folder, Mary Ann's Legacy. Inside, I organized digital copies of every document, every piece of evidence, every proof of the truth they couldn't imagine. The DNA results that would shatter Franklin's assumptions about his biological family, the will that would transfer everything to me, the journal entries that would expose their neglect and greed. But most importantly, I had something they could never have expected: patience. They were rushing toward the will reading, confident in their victory, building their case on a foundation of lies and assumptions. I could wait. I'd been waiting my entire life to be seen as an equal member of this family. A few more months wouldn't matter. When the truth finally came out, it would be devastating, and it would be public. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a family gathering that would prove to be the most revealing yet. Franklin had decided to host an Easter celebration at Riverside Park, the same place where we'd held family reunions throughout my childhood. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Another opportunity for him to play the patriarch, surrounded by relatives who would witness his generosity and leadership. I arrived at the pavilion to find Franklin and Ethan already holding court, regaling cousins and family friends with stories of their business successes and plans for the future. A banner reading "Celebrating Marianne's Life" hung between two trees, as if this were some kind of memorial celebration rather than what it really was, a preview of Franklin and Ethan's upcoming inheritance. "There he is," Franklin called out as I approached, his voice carrying that false heartiness he used in public. "Our Caleb, always punctual, always reliable." The words sounded like praise, but I'd learned to hear the subtext. Punctual and reliable were the qualities you valued in an employee, not a son. They were maintenance qualities, not leadership qualities. Ethan was standing near the picnic tables, a beer in his hand and that easy smile that had charmed teachers, girlfriends, and clients throughout his life. He was in the middle of describing his latest sales triumph to our cousin Derek, a story that involved a 6-figure commission and a client who was practically begging to sign. "The secret," Ethan was saying, "is understanding what people really want versus what they say they want. Most people don't actually know how to make good financial decisions, and they need someone with experience to guide them toward the right choice." Derek nodded appreciatively. "Sounds like you've got a real gift for reading people." "It runs in the family," Franklin interjected, moving into the conversation with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent decades networking at business events. "The Fostermen have always been good at understanding value, at seeing the big picture. It served us well over the years." I was setting up folding chairs nearby, close enough to hear every word but invisible enough that they spoke freely, the Fostermen. As if I weren't standing 10 feet away, as if I weren't part of the family whose legacy they were claiming. "Speaking of the big picture," Ethan said, lowering his voice slightly, "Dad and I have been thinking a lot about Mom's legacy, about how to honor what she built." Franklin nodded gravely. Marianne was incredibly smart about money. She understood investments, property values, long-term financial planning. She'd want her estate to be managed by people who share that sophistication. "Absolutely," Derek agreed. "You guys have always been the business minds in the family." I continued arranging chairs, but I'd started recording on my phone, capturing their casual dismissal of my capabilities and their assumption that Mom's estate was already theirs. Every word was being preserved, ready to be played back when the moment was right. "The thing is," Franklin continued, "we want to make sure we handle this transition properly. Caleb's been, well, he's been a little emotional about the whole thing. Understandable, of course. He spent a lot of time with Marianne at the end. But emotion and financial planning don't always mix well." Ethan chuckled. "Dad's being diplomatic. The truth is, Caleb's never shown much interest in money or property. He's more of a caretaker type. Great for day-to-day stuff, but when it comes to making strategic decisions about investments and estate management..." He shrugged, as if my limitations were obvious to everyone. "Plus," Franklin added, "Caleb's never had to manage significant assets. His biggest financial decision is probably choosing between cable packages. Marianne's estate is worth over $500,000. That requires real expertise. They were building their narrative in front of witnesses, establishing their superior qualifications while painting me as emotionally unstable and financially naive. Every word was calculated to justify what they planned to do, to make their exclusion of me seem reasonable and responsible, but they were also revealing something else: the exact extent of their greed and the depth of their contempt for me. This wasn't just about money, it was about power, about maintaining the family hierarchy that had always placed them at the top and me at the bottom. As the afternoon wore on, I moved through the gathering like a ghost, present but unnoticed, listening to conversation after conversation that reinforced the same themes. Franklin was the successful businessman, Ethan was the rising star, and I was the well-meaning but limited family member who needed to be protected from his own poor judgment. The most damning moment came when Franklin was talking to his brother-in-law, Uncle Pete, near the memorial display we'd set up with Mom's photos. "You know, Pete, Franklin said, his voice taking on that confidential tone he used when sharing what he considered deep insights. Marianne always worried about Caleb. Wonderful kid, don't get me wrong, but he never developed that ruthless edge you need to really succeed. She used to say he was too trusting, too willing to let other people take advantage of him. Uncle Pete nodded thoughtfully. Some people are just built different. Not everyone can be a shark. Exactly. And Marianne understood that. She knew that if she left everything to Caleb, he'd probably lose it within a few years. Bad investments, people taking advantage of his good nature, maybe some woman who saw dollar signs. Franklin shook his head sadly. She was too smart for that. She'd want her money to go where it could actually build something lasting. I was standing behind the memorial display, supposedly arranging flowers, but actually recording every word. Franklin wasn't just planning to steal my inheritance. He was using Mom's memory to justify it, claiming that her love for me was actually evidence that she wouldn't trust me with her estate. The psychological manipulation was breathtaking. He was rewriting history, turning Mom's concern for my well-being into proof that she'd want to exclude me from her will. He was using her love against me, but as I listened to him destroy my character and claim my inheritance, I felt that familiar calm settling over me. Let him talk. Let him build his case. Let him convince everyone that he and Ethan were the rightful heirs to Mom's legacy. In 4 months, I would stand up in open court and present evidence that would demolish every assumption he'd made. The DNA test that would prove he wasn't my father. The will that specifically left everything to Mom's biological son, me, the journal entries that documented his neglect and greed during her final months. But most devastating of all would be the recordings I was making, the careful documentation of his lies and manipulation. When the judge asked why Mom might have written her will the way she did, I'd have hours of audio proving exactly what kind of men Franklin and Ethan really were. That evening, I returned to my apartment and spent 2 hours organizing my evidence. I'd created multiple backup systems by now. Copies stored at work, copies in my safety deposit box, copies with my lawyer, copies uploaded to secure cloud storage. Franklin and Ethan thought they were dealing with someone naive and disorganized. They had no idea how methodically I'd been preparing for this battle. I opened Mom's letter and read it again, focusing on one particular passage. I trust you to know when the time is right to reveal what I couldn't. The time was coming. 4 more months of watching them celebrate their assumed victory, 4 more months of enduring their casual cruelty, 4 more months of being treated like a second-class family member. But when the truth finally came out, it would be worth every moment of patience. My phone buzzed. A text from Aunt Sharon in Oregon. Thinking about you today, Caleb, I know how hard these family gatherings can be. Your mother always said you were the strongest person she knew, stronger than you realized. I believe she was right. I stared at the message for a long time. Aunt Sharon had always been perceptive, had always seen through Franklin's charm and Ethan's manipulation. I wondered if she suspected the truth, if she'd picked up on hints that Mom had dropped over the years. I texted back, "Thanks, Aunt Sharon. I think Mom left me everything I need to handle whatever comes next." Her response came quickly. "I'm sure she did. And Caleb? When the time comes, don't let them intimidate you. You have more power than they think." I smiled, looking around my quiet apartment at the carefully organized evidence that would soon change everything. Aunt Sharon was right. I did have more power than they thought. In 4 months, they would find out exactly how much. The weeks leading up to the will reading took on a surreal quality, like watching a play where I knew the ending, but the other actors were completely unaware of the plot twist waiting in the final scene. Franklin and Ethan's confidence had reached almost comic proportions, their assumptions about the inheritance so absolute that they'd stopped pretending to include me in family discussions. The shift became most apparent during what Franklin called estate planning meetings, sessions held at his house where he and Ethan would discuss their plans for Mom's assets. I learned about these meetings the same way I learned about most family decisions, accidentally, through overheard phone calls or casual mentions. "We're meeting with Richard again this Thursday," Ethan mentioned during one of our increasingly rare conversations. "Going over the final details for the will reading, Dad thinks we should have everything mapped out beforehand. You know, which assets we'll liquidate, which ones we'll keep, how to handle the tax implications." The casual assumption that they would be making these decisions was stunning in its arrogance. They weren't planning for the possibility that they might inherit Mom's estate. They were planning as if it were already theirs. "What about me?" I asked, genuinely curious to see how they'd respond. Ethan's expression shifted to that patronizing smile he'd perfected over the years. "Oh, Caleb, of course you'll be taken care of. We've already talked about setting aside some money for you, enough to maybe upgrade your living situation or take a nice vacation. Mom would want us to look out for you." The phrase, "look out for you," was particularly galling. It implied that I was some kind of charity case, a family obligation that needed to be managed rather than an equal heir with legitimate rights. "How much were you thinking?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Franklin, who'd been listening from across the room, walked over with that authoritative stride he used when dispensing family decisions. "We were thinking maybe 25,000. That's generous, considering your mother's actual intentions were clearly focused on her immediate family. $25,000. Out of an estate worth over $500,000. They were offering me roughly 5% of Mom's assets, as if they were being magnanimous." "That seems fair," I said quietly. "I appreciate you thinking of me." Franklin's smile was warm and condescending. "That's what family is for, Caleb. We take care of each other." I nodded and excused myself, walking to my car with their words echoing in my head. $25,000. A tip for 37 years of being the family's afterthought. A consolation prize for months of caring for Mom while they pursued their own interests. That evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing the documents that would soon make their generous offer irrelevant. The will that left me everything. The DNA test that proved I was Mom's only biological son. The trust fund from Vincent Moreau that they didn't even know existed. By my calculations, I would inherit not just Mom's $500,000 estate, but also nearly $200,000 from my biological father's trust. I was going from their charity case to the sole heir of almost $750,000. The irony was almost perfect. 3 weeks before the will reading, I met with my own lawyer, Margaret Corrin, a sharp estate attorney I'd hired quietly 6 months earlier. Her office was across town from Richard Hawthorne's in a building that specialized in family law rather than business transactions. "I've reviewed all your documents," Margaret said, spreading the papers across her conference table. "The will is ironclad, the DNA evidence is definitive, and the trust fund documentation is all in order. Legally, you have an absolutely solid case." "What about their lawyer?" I asked. "Richard Hawthorne has been handling Franklin's business for years. He's going to fight this." Margaret smiled grimly. "Mr. Hawthorne specializes in real estate law and business contracts. Estate disputes involving paternity questions are outside his usual expertise. He's going to be caught completely off guard by this evidence." She pulled out a timeline she'd prepared. "Here's how this will likely play out. The will reading is scheduled for 2 p.m. on Thursday. Richard will start by reading the will, probably expecting a straightforward division of assets. When he gets to the phrase, 'my biological son,' he'll likely interpret it as referring to both you and Ethan, or he'll ask for clarification about your mother's intentions." "That's when I present the DNA evidence?" "Exactly. The moment there's any question about the biological son designation, you produce the test results. At that point, the entire proceeding changes. Richard will have to acknowledge that the will's language is specific and unambiguous. Everything goes to you." Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying my face. "Caleb, I have to ask, are you prepared for how explosive this is going to be? Your father and brother are going to be blindsided. They're expecting to inherit $500,000, and instead they're going to discover that Franklin isn't your biological father and they're getting nothing. The reaction is going to be intense." I thought about the 8 months of casual dismissal, the decades of being treated as less than, the cruel assumptions about my limitations and their superiority. "I'm ready." "Good, because there's something else you should know. Will readings are typically private affairs, but given the size of the estate and the family dynamics Richard has described to me through professional channels, he's requested that this one be held in a formal courtroom setting. There will likely be a court reporter, possibly some media presence if word gets out about the dispute." My heart rate spiked. Media? Small-town estate disputes sometimes attract attention, especially when significant money is involved. The Foster name carries some weight in this community because of your father's real estate background. If reporters show up, this won't just be a private family humiliation, it'll be public. The idea of Franklin and Ethan's arrogance being exposed in front of cameras and reporters added a dimension I hadn't anticipated. Their carefully constructed image of successful family men, their narrative about being Mom's rightful heirs, their casual dismissal of my worth, all of it would be revealed as lies in the most public way possible. "I can live with that," I said. The final week before the will reading passed in a strange haze of normalcy. I went to work, handled my usual IT consultations, attended meetings, and maintained the routine I'd built over years of quiet, steady living. But underneath the surface, I felt like a coiled spring, ready to release 8 months of accumulated tension and 37 years of suppressed anger. Franklin called me twice during that week, both times to check in and make sure I was prepared for Thursday. I know this might be emotional for you, Caleb, he said during the second call. Hearing your mother's final wishes, dealing with the legal formalities, it can be overwhelming. But I want you to know that Ethan and I are going to make sure you're taken care of. This doesn't have to be traumatic. His tone was gentle, almost fatherly, which made his condescension even more infuriating. He genuinely believed he was being kind, preparing me for disappointment while positioning himself as my protector. I appreciate that, Franklin, I said, using his first name deliberately. I'm sure Mom's wishes will be very clear. That's the spirit. Keep an open mind, and remember, family is about more than money. We're going to get through this together. After I hung up, I realized that Franklin's calls weren't just about managing my expectations. He was worried. Despite his confidence, despite Richard's assurances, despite 8 months of assuming victory, some part of him was nervous about what Mom might have written in that will. He should be nervous. The night before the will reading, I laid out my clothes, a simple dark suit, the same one I'd worn to Mom's funeral, and organized my briefcase with copies of all the key documents. Margaret had the originals, but I wanted my own set, carefully arranged in the order we'd discussed. I sat at my kitchen table, looking at the red envelope that contained the DNA test results. Such a small thing to hold such enormous power. A few pages of scientific data that would destroy Franklin's assumptions about his family, Ethan's assumptions about his inheritance, and Richard's assumptions about a simple estate division. My phone buzzed, a text from Ethan. Big day tomorrow, bro. Hope you're ready for some closure. This has been hanging over all of us for too long. I stared at the message, marveling at his complete obliviousness. He thought tomorrow would bring closure, the final confirmation of his and Franklin's superior position in the family hierarchy. He had no idea that tomorrow would bring the complete destruction of everything he'd assumed about his life. I texted back, I'm ready. See you in court. His response was immediate. That's the attitude. This'll all be over soon, and we can move forward as a family. I turned off my phone and went to bed, sleeping better than I had in months. Tomorrow, after 8 months of patience, after 37 years of being underestimated and dismissed, the truth would finally come out, and Franklin and Ethan would learn what it felt like to be powerless. The Riverside County Courthouse was buzzing with more activity than I'd expected when I arrived at 1:30 p.m. Margaret had been right about the media interest. I spotted 2 local news vans in the parking lot, and several people with cameras and notepads gathered near the main entrance. Word had gotten out about the Foster estate dispute, probably through court filings or Richard Hawthorne's office. In a town the size of Riverside, a $500,000 inheritance battle involving a prominent former realtor was apparently newsworthy. I walked through the courthouse lobby, my briefcase in hand, feeling strangely calm despite the magnitude of what was about to happen. 8 months of preparation had led to this moment, and I was ready. Franklin and Ethan were already in the hallway outside courtroom 3, surrounded by what looked like a small entourage of supporters. I recognized several family friends, a few business associates of Franklin's, and Uncle Pete. They were all dressed formally, all wearing the somber expressions appropriate for a legal proceeding, but there was an unmistakable air of confidence around the group. Franklin spotted me first. He was wearing his most expensive suit, the charcoal gray one he'd bought for important business meetings, and his silver hair was perfectly styled. At 65, he still cut an impressive figure. The successful businessman, the family patriarch, the man who commanded respect in every room he entered. Caleb, he called out, his voice carrying that hearty warmth he used in public. There you are. We were starting to worry you might be running late. Ethan turned at the sound of Franklin's voice, and I saw him quickly scan my appearance, taking in my simple suit and modest briefcase. His smile was confident, almost pitying, as if he felt sorry for me walking into a battle I couldn't possibly win. Hey, big brother, he said, using the nickname that had always felt more like mockery than affection. Ready for this? I'm ready, I replied simply. Richard Hawthorne emerged from the courtroom, looking every inch the successful attorney in his expensive suit and Italian leather shoes. He was carrying a thick briefcase and wearing the satisfied expression of a lawyer who'd prepared thoroughly for an easy victory. Gentlemen, he said, nodding to Franklin and Ethan before glancing briefly at me, we should head inside. Judge Harper likes to start promptly. As we walked into the courtroom, I noticed the setup was more formal than I'd anticipated. Judge Harper's bench dominated the front of the room, with a court reporter stationed to one side and a witness stand nearby. There were rows of wooden benches for observers, and I could see they were already filling up with family members, friends, and what appeared to be local reporters. Margaret was waiting at one of the attorney tables, her own briefcase open and organized. She gave me a subtle nod as I took my seat beside her. Across the aisle, Franklin and Ethan sat with Richard, their heads together in quiet conversation. Judge Denise Harper entered at exactly 2 p.m., and the bailiff called the courtroom to order. She was a woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately commanded attention. "We're here today for the reading of the last will and testament of Mary Ann Foster, deceased," Judge Harper announced, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "This is a formal proceeding due to questions raised about the interpretation of certain provisions in the will." She looked around the courtroom, taking in the assembled crowd. "I see we have significant family and community interest in this matter. I want to make it clear that while this is a public proceeding, I expect complete decorum throughout." Richard stood up, smoothing his tie with practiced confidence. "Your Honor, I represent Franklin Foster, the deceased's husband, and Ethan Foster, one of her sons. We're here to ensure that Mrs. Foster's wishes are properly interpreted and executed." Margaret rose from beside me. "Your Honor, I represent Caleb Foster, Mrs. Foster's other son. We're here to ensure that Mrs. Foster's explicit instructions are followed precisely as written." Judge Harper nodded and gestured to Richard. "Mr. Hawthorne, please read the relevant portion of the will." Richard opened his briefcase with a flourish, producing a bound document. He cleared his throat and began reading in the formal tone lawyers use for legal proceedings. "I, Mary Ann Foster, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath all of my worldly possessions, including but not limited to my house at 1247 Maple Street, all bank accounts, investment portfolios, personal property, and jewelry, to my biological son, with the understanding that he will know the significance of this designation." A murmur went through the courtroom. Several people turned to look at Ethan and me, clearly wondering how the assets would be divided between two sons. Richard continued reading, covering the standard legal language about executors and contingencies, but the key phrase hung in the air: "my biological son." When he finished, Judge Harper looked up from her notes. "Mr. Hawthorne, how do you interpret the phrase, 'my biological son,' given that Mrs. Foster had two sons?" Richard's confidence was unshakable. "Your Honor, we believe Mrs. Foster was simply being formal in her language. The phrase biological son was meant to distinguish her sons from any adopted children or stepchildren. Since both Caleb and Ethan are her biological children with her husband Franklin, we interpret this as referring to both sons equally." Judge Harper turned to Margaret. "Ms. Corrin, what is your client's position?" Margaret stood, and I felt my heart rate increase. This was the moment 8 months of preparation had built toward. "Your Honor, we believe Mrs. Foster's language was deliberately specific. She wrote, 'my biological son,' singular, not sons, plural. We have evidence that proves exactly which son she was referring to." Franklin leaned forward in his seat, his brow furrowed. Ethan's confident smile faltered slightly. Richard looked annoyed, as if Margaret were unnecessarily complicating a simple matter. "What evidence?" Judge Harper asked. Margaret nodded to me, and I opened my briefcase, pulling out the red envelope I'd been carrying for 8 months. My hands were steady as I handed it to her. "Your Honor, we have DNA test results that definitively establish which of Mrs. Foster's sons is her biological child." The courtroom went completely silent. I could hear the court reporter's fingers pause over her keyboard. In the gallery behind us, I heard someone whisper, "Did she say DNA test?" Richard shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We weren't informed of any paternity issues. This appears to be a desperate attempt to—" "Mr. Hawthorne," Judge Harper interrupted, her voice sharp. "Sit down. Ms. Corrin, approach the bench." Margaret walked forward with the envelope, and I watched Judge Harper's face as she examined the contents. Her expression remained neutral, but I could see her reading carefully, taking in the full implications of what she was seeing. After several minutes, she looked up. "Mr. Hawthorne, Ms. Corrin, approach the bench for a sidebar." The 3 lawyers huddled near Judge Harper's bench, speaking in whispers too low for the rest of us to hear. But I could see Richard's face changing as Margaret presumably explained what the DNA test revealed. His confident expression crumbled, replaced by shock and something that looked like panic. Franklin and Ethan were both staring at me now, confusion and growing alarm evident in their faces. Franklin leaned over to whisper something to Ethan, who shook his head, clearly as bewildered as his father. The sidebar lasted nearly 10 minutes. When the lawyers returned to their tables, Richard looked like a man who'd just learned his case had evaporated. Judge Harper cleared her throat. "After reviewing the evidence presented by Ms. Corrin, I'm prepared to make a ruling on the interpretation of Mrs. Foster's will." She looked directly at Franklin, and her next words cut through the courtroom like a blade. "Mr. Foster, the DNA evidence shows that you are not the biological father of Caleb Foster. The test confirms that you are the biological father of Ethan Foster, but Caleb Foster is not your biological child." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. I heard someone behind me say, "Oh my God," in a shocked whisper. Camera flashes started going off as reporters captured the moment of revelation. Franklin's face went completely white. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who'd just been told that everything he believed about his life was wrong. Ethan's reaction was even more dramatic. His confident smirk disappeared entirely, replaced by a look of absolute horror as the implications hit him. If I wasn't Franklin's biological son, and the will left everything to Mom's biological son, then... Judge Harper continued, her voice cutting through the chaos in the courtroom. The will's language is now completely clear. Mrs. Foster left all of her assets to my biological son, singular. The DNA evidence establishes that Caleb Foster is her only biological son. Therefore, the entire estate passes to Caleb Foster. The courtroom erupted. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing. Family members in the gallery were talking over each other, their voices rising in shock and confusion. I could hear Uncle Pete saying, "This can't be right," and one of Franklin's business associates asking, "What does this mean?" But I was focused on Franklin and Ethan. Franklin was still staring at me, his face a mask of disbelief and growing horror. The man who'd spent 37 years treating me as less than, who'd dismissed my worth and questioned my capabilities, was realizing that I was about to inherit everything he'd assumed was his. Ethan looked like he might be sick. His face had gone from pale to green, and he was gripping the edge of the table as if he needed physical support. The brother who'd mocked my modest lifestyle, who'd offered me $25,000 as charity, was watching $500,000 slip away from him forever. Richard Hawthorne was frantically shuffling through papers, clearly trying to find some legal avenue to challenge what had just happened. But I could see in his face that he knew it was hopeless. The DNA evidence was definitive, the will's language was clear, and his clients had just lost everything. Judge Harper banged her gavel, trying to restore order to the chaotic courtroom. The court rules that the estate of Marianne Foster passes in its entirety to Caleb Foster, as specified in her will. This proceeding is concluded. As the judge's gavel fell and the courtroom erupted in chaos, Franklin stared at me in horror. Ethan's face drained of all color, and Richard dropped his papers. The last thing I saw was their world collapsing in front of everyone.